The one. All right. So, yeah, we're going to do the car forms update. This rolled out a couple weeks ago. So if you've noticed a couple changes that, when you're going in there to get forms, maybe something's missing, maybe something's new. We're going to review what those changes are real quick. So, if you have any questions, throw them in the chat. And I guess if you have questions on anything else, you can throw it in the chat as well, and we'll get those answered for you. Um, all right, so they rolled out 30 drafts of existing or new documents that are in your zip forms library. Three are brand new forms. That's going to be your PRBS-B, PRBS-S, and the RCJC TOPA. So you may notice some changes with the PRBS when you're pulling up your packages now. The bundles, either the listing bundle or the purchase bundle. So the rest are revisions, and several of those just conform to a change made elsewhere, mainly in the RPA family. There's many different RPAs depending on the type of purchase you are going to be performing. And you want to obviously associate the correct RPA for that type of purchase. A lot of this stuff was just kind of making it uniform throughout when they made changes to the RPA, which most of us use pretty regularly. So we'll cover about 19 of the 30 forms. The other 11 are smaller edits. We'll just summarize those at the end. There's really, nothing groundbreaking about them. So RPA and the purchase agreements. So like I said, we have a lot of different types of purchase agreements. So when you go to write an offer on a property that is not a single family 1 to 4 unit, be sure to check the forms library on which RPA you should be using, which one best associates with that type of property. Um, Basically, all of those are conformed to whatever changes in the RPA were made. So the same handful of updates are applied through all 7 purchase agreements. Biggest notable change, the old GTO, the geographic targeting order, reporting language is gone. They replaced it with a requirement to cooperate with FinCEN reporting, which is the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Now requires reporting on all cash or non-institutionally financed purchases of 1 to 4 unit residential property when the buyer is an entity or trust. So if you have an all cash transaction, um, see if this needs to be reported or not. Escrow should be picking up on this and filing the correct forms, but that's going to be a trigger for you to possibly have a conversation with your buyer. So if you're doing cash or entity buyers, expect escrow to start asking for these. So basically, this is a snippet of all the language they put in for the FinCEN rule, and basically saying that you're going to comply if this applies to you is what this is essentially stating. So um, other changes in the purchase agreements, we'll just go through a few. I took out some snippets too, just so you can kind of see them in the red. I like when they do these drafts and they have the red line stuff so we can actually see what the changes are rather than trying to figure it out. So the appraisal contingency now has built-in option to run off the appraisal gap instead of a flat value. Seller credits got split out, so they're not automatically limited to closing costs or buyer broker comp. So you can see that in G2. If you just want to ask for a seller credit, you're going to put it in G1. If you want to specify how it's broken down, you can do that in G2 now. And there's a new septic well propane disclosure tied to a new form, which is the SWPI C, SWPI-C. So that's going to be there on Q16. You'll see they added in septic well, propane tank, and or property boundary survey. And then basically it's referenced. If you check that box, it's going to add in that form, the SWPI C, and you're going to fill that out with your offer. And that would be for, generally more rural properties that have any or all of those items on the property. Let me see. What if we do have a quick question on the FinCEN? What if the offer is 50% cash and 50% financed? It's going to be for all cash purchase, is my understanding, anyways. So deposit return language also clarified. So buyer's deposit comes back even after a demand to close escrow if the buyer is still working to satisfy a contingency. So what does that scenario look like? Maybe you're towards the end of the escrow. You're getting close to the close of escrow date. Buyer still has a loan contingency in place because they're still working through some details. And the seller sent the notice to perform. A demand to close, because now you're at the close of escrow date contractually, or maybe you're even past it. And they're upset because you haven't closed. You still have this loan contingency in place. They send that out to the DCE. Obviously, you're protecting your buyers. You're saying, hey, I'm not going to release this loan contingency until it's safe. Either the buyer can, I guess choose to cancel, but this is in the event that the seller cancels on you after the notice. They're saying that the earnest money needs to be released back to the buyer now. So they did. That's kind of a major tweak there. That does apply on the notice to performs, but it hasn't previously on the demand to closes. So they did change that. We'll look in red right here. After the DCE period has lapsed, any subsequent cancellation must be delivered in writing and signed by the party canceling the agreement. If seller cancels based on DCE and buyer still has a contingency, seller shall authorize the return of buyer's deposit except for fees incurred by the buyer and other expenses already paid by escrow holder pursuant to this agreement prior to seller's cancellation, provided the buyer is acting in good faith to satisfy the contingency. So I guess that's your little called a gray area, I guess, where it can be disputed. Is the buyer still proactively seeking this loan, and that's why they still have this loan contingency in place, and maybe they're just getting conditioned like crazy, who knows? But has the buyer been, providing what the lender needs to get this loan, uh, you know, procured? So next up, a few other minor but notable changes to the RPA. Additional advisories and disclosures were added to paragraph 4. Nothing groundbreaking, but you can see in red the ones that they added in to the purchase agreement. So now you can add these, kind of directly from here instead of kind of tacking them on at the end. So check the box, should be automatically adding these in for you. So seller and buyer right to cancel must be in writing language added. So this is in the cancellations paragraph of the RPA, and you can see in red, seller right to cancel must be done in writing and signed by the seller. Same thing for the buyer, must be done in writing and signed by the buyer. So what form are you going to use for that? You are going to use, more than likely, form CC, cancellation of contract. So just be sure you get that in writing when one or the other party says they want to cancel. Just don't call up the other, agent and say, hey, we're canceling. We need something in writing. Use that cancellation form. Expanded language for the loan contingency to include exclusions for insurance and appraisal. I've said this numerous times in meetings and, contingency trainings and things like that. The insurance contingency is not part of the loan contingency. That is actually part of the investigations contingency. So if you go and release your entire investigations contingency and the buyer has not procured a satisfactory insurance quote, and let's say you're getting, close to releasing the loan or, maybe the appraisal contingency. Finally, they get their quote and they say, wow, this is going to be way too much. I got to go with the fair plan, this and that. They can't cancel then legally uh, based on that if they have already released their investigations contingency. So it is not part of the loan contingency. So be sure you understand that and you have that conversation with them early, basically about next steps of opening escrow and things like that is, hey, get your insurance quote ASAP. We don't have to bind it, but we need to make sure that you can get something satisfactory. Um, Also, they added language for septic and propane. This is going to be O, and then they kind of made it a little longer there. So it says for properties with any septic tank systems or wells or propane tanks, seller shall, within a time specified in 3N1, deliver to buyer all known information about such systems and/or items, and sellers shall use septic well propane tank questionnaire. It's the SWIPY Q. So if you haven't looked at that, um, go check it out. So especially if you deal with rural a lot, or um, yeah, if you're gonna have your first one come up, uh, definitely go check out those forms. So they're going to be asking questions about the systems in place on the property. The RIPA, that is the residential income purchase agreement, gets one thing on top of that on all of this, and that's a new paragraph specifically for assigning existing tenancies when the property being sold as income property. So that's relating to the leases that are in place there. Next up, we have the RLA. Wasn't a ton here, but a couple things. So the unrepresented buyer compensation paragraph now spells out what to do when the buyer doesn't have their own agent. If you're not representing that buyer, the form directs you to give them a buyer non-agency agreement. That is Form BNA. So there's a record you are not working for them. If you're the dual agent, it makes clear the listing agreement alone doesn't earn you buyer side compensation, and you still need a separate signed agreement with the buyer. This section is probably the most misread or overlooked section in the RLA. Um, we're looking at the C section here, C2, which is the additional compensation to seller's broker. So we'll back up real quick. C1, this is where you put your compensation as a listing agent, not listing and also what we're offering the buyer's agent, just your compensation. So whatever amount that is that you will be asking to be paid or negotiating to be paid goes in C1. Could be percentage, could be flat fee, could be percentage plus fee, doesn't really matter, but it's only the listing agent's compensation. C2 is not dual agency. This is not saying, hey, seller, if I bring a buyer, then I'm going to be charging this fee instead. This is absolutely not what this section is for, and this is what seems to be the biggest question on the RLA that I get on literally a weekly basis. So the additional compensation to seller's broker for additional effort needed to facilitate a transaction if buyer is not represented by a real estate agent. I call this the extra work fee. Call it whatever you want, but essentially, as a listing agent, if you have an unrepresented buyer come through, whatever, a phone call, an open house, whatever, they say, I don't have an agent and I don't want an agent. I don't want you to represent me. I don't want anybody to represent me, but I want to buy this house. You, as the listing agent, have a fiduciary duty to facilitate this transaction still. So yes, you need to open up doors for appraisals. You need to attend a home inspection most likely and open up that door. You're gonna have to provide blank forms to the buyer for them to sign and uh, present back over to you. So there is extra work in this, and that's why I call it the extra work fee. So what do I typically see? Yeah, maybe another percent or another 0.5% or something like that to facilitate that scenario. So let's look at the very right column here. Yes, you would put in, the extra amount you would like to be compensated for dealing with an unrepresented buyer. It could be a percentage, a flat fee, or both, whichever. And in red, they put in here, if broker is not representing buyer, broker is advised to provide the unrepresented buyer with a buyer non-agency agreement, BNA. So in that scenario, I'd say, hey, no problem, buyer, here's a BNA. I'm going to have you sign that. And then we're going to go ahead and move forward with this. Can you're not negotiating terms with them back and forth necessarily on what they want you to write in the offer to give to them, they technically need to do that. So you can provide them a blank offer and the blank forms that they need to do what they need to do. There's some security requirements on the forms. You do have to put in the address at minimum, and I think the parties' names on the contract. You can't send a completely blank form, but um, the last section, it says, if broker represents both buyer and seller, broker must obtain a separate written agreement with the buyer that establishes the broker's right to compensation for buyer's side of the transaction. So this would be the alternate scenario, which is you have the listing, maybe you have an open house or whatever. Buyer calls you up, says, I am not represented, I am not working with an agent, or I'm not exclusively working with an agent. I would like you to represent me. This is not the fee that you're obtaining in C2. This is not that. You will put a buyer representation agreement in place with the buyer, just as you would with any other buyer. And then in the offer, in G3, you're going to ask for the compensation to be paid by the seller, just as usual. So that is how you handle the dual agency. If it's an unrepresented buyer, then that is not a dual agency, and C2 does not apply in that scenario. So yeah, I saw a question come in. I'd love to take any other questions you have about this particular section of the contract, because this is the one I get the most questions on for the RLA. So actually, that was someone's note taker. So okay, if you don't have questions, we're gonna move on. Hopefully everybody gets that. Second change on this form, the photo marketing disclosure now explicitly names social media alongside the internet. So the existing disclaimer that the broker and seller don't control who sees or reshares listing photos now unambiguously covers Instagram, Facebook, etc., not just generic web posting. So you can see in red, they just added or on social media right there. Um, Next up. So the CLA, RLAN. So this is commercial forms. We'll just touch on these real quick. CLA, Commercial and Residential Income Listing Agreement, picks up the same RLA changes, same unrepresented buyer BNA language, same social media clarification. The RLAN, which is the open, non-exclusive version of the listing agreement, gets the same updates plus its own line. Since it's a non-exclusive listing, the form now spells out that the seller can sell directly to a buyer or through another broker without owing the brokerage anything, as long as the brokerage didn't have a hand in it. So did you work on it or not on that buyer? And you can see right there, and in this form rarely, if ever, gets used. I actually never see this type of listing agreement, but they did add that in there. BRBC. So this is your buyer rep agreement. One addition, if your buyer assigns their purchase contract to someone else, you still get paid. The form now says explicitly that the broker is entitled to the agreed upon compensation, even when buyer assigns their rights to purchase through whatever the assignee pays you directly gets credited, or sorry, though whatever the assignee pays you directly gets credited against it. So this closes a loophole where an assignment could otherwise be read as walking away from the agreement. And in red, you can see here, they put in a number 5, says buyer assignment. Unless otherwise agreed, if the buyer assigns the buyer's rights to purchase this property described in this agreement for which the buyer has entered into a contract to purchase, then the broker shall be entitled to the compensation specified in paragraph 2E1. Such compensation shall be reduced by any amounts the assignee pays to the broker. So this would be specifically dealing with assignments, which we see more of these days than we used to. As we talked about in the beginning, the PRBS has been split into 2 separate documents now. This update is structural and not just wording. PRBS, which is the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. Disclosure used to be bundled inside the RPA package. Now it's 2 standalone forms. PRBS B goes out with the buyer representation paperwork. PRBS S goes out with listings. Practically, this means you'll be attaching this disclosure earlier in the relationship, either at buyer rep signing or listing signing, instead of just showing up buried in the purchase contract. So, nothing crazy here, but it's not part of the RPA bundle anymore. The AOAA, Assignment of Agreement Amendment. So this one got a rewrite. And this one is always a little challenging. So you use this when you are assigning the purchase agreement to, a completely new buyer, a new entity. You're adding or subtracting a buyer from the purchase. There's multiple uses for this form, but this is the one you use. So it now spells out checkbox by checkbox who represents the assignee once a buyer assigns their contract. Either the office continues representing the assignee under the existing buyer rep agreement, or the assignee brings in a different broker entirely with a dedicated section for naming that other broker and confirming the original buyer isn't released from their obligations just because a deal has been assigned, which we just reviewed. So if you handle assignments like wholesaling, adjacent deals especially, this is the form to slow down and pay attention to. And you can see all of this in red that has been changed, or blue, which was added. So definitely, read through this one a little more in detail if you are going to be doing any sort of assignment, especially, again, like I said, adding a buyer, things like that. Or if the buyer wants to all of a sudden put their home into a trust or an LLC during escrow, this is the form that you use for that. Lease listing agreement, new checkbox for compensation on subsequent sale to tenant. So property owners can now agree right in the listing agreement that the lease listing agreement, if you are going to be leasing a property for somebody, you must have an agreement, which is the lease listing agreement. You cannot market that property without that, just the same as a sale. So this is that document that we're talking about right now. So they can agree right in the listing agreement to pay the brokerage a commission if the tenant ends up buying the property later during the lease term or any extension. So that is the key words there. It's an opt-in, so the RPO, that is a rental property owner, has to check the box and initial. But if you don't ask for it up front, you can't add it in after the fact. So this is just one little section here, section F of the lease listing agreement, stating, hey, rental property owner, should this tenant decide to buy this property from you during this lease term, I would be due compensation there. So you can add that in. Commercial lease agreement, we don't see a ton of these, but here and there. Three things on this one. The one clearly visible in this draft, a new paragraph letting landlord and tenant agree up front on who's responsible for replacing big ticket items, HVAC, electrical, plumbing, water systems, roof, foundation, exterior walls, etc. When they fail beyond repair, not just who maintains them day to day. So C.A.R's release notes also list the new broker compensation paragraph and a conformed agency confirmation section for this form, bringing the commercial leases in line with how compensation and agency are documented on the residential side. So you'll see they added in section E here, replacement. If tenant is responsible for maintenance of any of the following items, tenants shall also be responsible for replacing the following, and then you're going to check box what it would be. The BCO and LDAA. So counteroffers and the liquidated damages paperwork. So these two got updated together. The BCO, which is the counteroffer, the buyer counteroffer, sorry, now has a direct checkbox to attach the liquidated damages and arbitration agreement. That is the LDAA. When not everyone has initialed those clauses in the original offer instead of leaving it ambiguous. So let's see, you're on the listing side and you received an offer and maybe one of the buyers signed, initialed one of those sections, the other one didn't, or maybe they didn't initial any of them. You can add this in to the counter offer. They added it on the BCO and all the others, the multiples, the sellers. So you would add in this form if you want them to initial the liquidated damages paperwork, which I do recommend. The LDAA itself got the matching update. It used to only pair with the additional signature addendum, the ASA, and now it can attach directly to a counteroffer or an amendment. Some clarification landed on the seller counteroffer and seller multiple counteroffer. Also simplified the appraisal gap explanation on counters, and late acceptance is now boxed off to make it clear. It's a separate track from the rest of the form. So you'll see here in red, they added in liquidated damages. Section B, the down payment, loan amount, deposits, credits, and then the appraisal contingency gap is C. So this is what they added in on the counters now. I think this is pretty much the last big one here. So the RCJC TOPA. So this is a brand new form. So this would be for investment properties, investment property purchases. Rent cap and just clause addendum for tenant occupied property. It pairs with the tenant occupied property addendum, that's the TOPA, on deals where a buyer is purchasing a property with a tenant already in place, and it's designed to flag whether the existing rental agreement actually incorporates the Tenant Protection Act's rent cap and just cause eviction protections. If the current lease doesn't have those terms, this form gives buyer a way to request seller get them added before close of escrow. Given how much rent cap just cause enforcement has ramped up, this is a notable form to add to your file in those rare cases. It's not super rare, but it is rare. A lot of times these tenants are to be vacated, prior to close of escrow. But if you are selling a investment property that has a tenant remaining in place, you may need to use this if they do not have the RCJC signed. So just look, all you have to do is look at the lease that they have in place, and hopefully you will see that RCJC or something similar to that included in that lease agreement. Everything else in the June's release, smaller edits, nothing to sleep over. the AAA, the additional agent acknowledgement, broadened to reference listing agreements generally, not just residential ones. AC, so the confirmation of agency, the agency confirmation language was adjusted a little bit and now works for leases too, not just purchases. The CCPA, which is that privacy advisory that's in um, your RPA bundle, clarified that broker's responsibility is limited to broker-related data collection and that the form explains the law without satisfying it for you. DCE, demand to close, we did touch on that one. Updated to match the RPA, change on what remedies are available when a demand to close escrow goes out while contingencies are still in effect. Exempt seller disclosure, added a reminder that a TDS exemption doesn't excuse seller from water heater bracing and smoke detector requirements. That is a federal law, so that they still need to, handle those. The LCA, which is the lease rental compensation agreement, compensation paragraphs conform to all the LO changes above. The LPD, lead-based paint, clarifies that the two pamphlet acknowledgement checkboxes are mutually exclusive. And the notice of broker-involved properties, now usable with tenant representation agreements, not just buyer rep. The discontinued forms for this round, the SELI, SELI, which didn't really get used a whole lot anyways, but that language got folded into the MLSA, which is the next document stacked behind your listing agreement. That is the multiple listing service addendum. And the old SWIPI, SWPI, replaced by two new forms, which is the SWIPI C and the SWIPI Q, which is the questionnaire, if you can remember. If anyone still has those saved as quick add favorites, you'll want to make sure you swap those out. So if you have a file with just, documents in there that you go and grab every now and then, you're going to want to make sure you refresh that actually with all these to make sure you have the most recent updated forms that you're using. So um, again, nothing too crazy this round. A lot of cleanup stuff it looks like. Trying to simplify some of the forms. Yeah, so that's about it. If there's no question, we can go ahead and wrap up for the day. You can always email me separately or call me if you don't want to type it out in the chat here. But hopefully that was helpful. This is recorded. It goes on the YouTube channel, Rise Realty CA. It also goes in our back office under the trainings and motivation tab. So that's riserealtyoffice.com. Go to trainings and motivation. Just click that right there and you'll see all the recordings from all of our previous webinars there. And if there is any material, we also add that link in as well. So you can always go back and instead of rewatching the whole thing, you can just read through the presentation material instead if that's a little easier for you. Usually a little quicker because I know a lot of times you're just looking for, like, I remember we covered that, but I don't remember where. You can just kind of skim through the document. So we do put those in there as well. Other than that, thank you for attending. We'll be back next week. And if you have any questions on anything, always give me a call. We'll talk to you soon. Have a great week.